Should churches be allowed to meet during these quarantines and lockdown? Is the government infringing upon religious rights? How does religious freedom come into play during a humanitarian crisis like we're dealing with right now? Well, today we come to a section of our study in the book of Luke, in chapter 20, that really comes into play about this very topic. It comes from a conversation between Jesus and some really annoying religious leaders. Hey everybody, I'm outside today because it's beautiful. You might get some background noise from the highway, but I just wanted to share this message with you today in our study. But before we get to there, in our last study in Luke, we left off at a very meaningful place with a parable in Luke chapter 19, ending in verse 28. And after that conversation, Jesus travels in getting closer to Jerusalem, and he gets to a town right outside of Jerusalem called Bethany. This is where Lazarus had been raised from the dead on a previous trip sometime before. And that's actually recorded in John's Gospel. But at this point, Luke briefly tells the story of what we now know as the triumphal entry, or what we call it today, Palm Sunday, which ironically is this coming Sunday. It's called the triumphal entry, though, because whenever there was a parade for a Caesar or a great general who was victorious in battle, it was called a triumphal procession. And here's a bit of interesting imagery for you. The general would ride into town on a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, or sometimes ride on a white horse himself. That was a symbol of power and purity and victory. The citizens of the town would then come out to meet the general or the Caesar as they are coming into town in their procession. So think about those images when you think about Jesus riding on a white horse in the book of Revelation, I think chapter 19, or when he's coming down out of the clouds in 1 Thessalonians, and we are caught up in the air to meet him. We're meeting him as he is proceeding back to earth. However, Israeli princes and judges would often ride donkeys, and their sons would ride on a donkey's colt. It was a symbol of humility and connection with the common people. So Jesus, the Son, is riding on the colt of a donkey during this triumphal entry. Interestingly though, other than the people waving palm branches and laying down their coats on the ground, and the religious leaders trying to get Jesus to stop this thing, and Jesus weeping over the future of Jerusalem, really other than this point is pretty anticlimactic. In fact, most harmony of the gospel agree that basically Jesus rides into the temple area, takes a look around, and because of the late hour, turns around and goes home, or actually goes back to Bethany for the night. But not a whole lot happened at that point. The cleansing of the temple that's mentioned in the bottom part of chapter 19 doesn't take place till the next morning. And then we move into Tuesday morning, and that's where Luke picks it up in chapter 20. And Tuesday morning, there is a lot of confrontation between Jesus and these annoying religious leaders, including the fact that they begin to question his authority. Where and who does it come from that he has the authority to say the things he does and do the things he did? Well, Jesus answered them by giving them a question that was really no way to answer without falling into a trap. He answered them in this strange way, and afterwards, when they don't answer, he then tells a parable called the parable of the vineyard, which is very revealing and convicting, and even the Pharisees and religious leaders knew that it was about them, and they weren't happy, and the crowd was shocked at the parable as well. So at this point, they decided to try to beat Jesus at his own game by attempting to ask him a question for what they thought there would be no good answer to. The hope was that his answer would either anger the people or catch the attention of the Roman soldiers, who would immediately label him as a traitor or as a rebel or an insurrectionist. Personally though, I find this whole scene kind of hilarious. Imagine trying to get into a chess game or a chess match of words with the one who created language. It'd be like picking up a basketball for the first time and then thinking that you can beat Michael Jordan or Larry Bird in their prime. It's just not going to happen. But let me tell you, they pull out all the stops. Let me read this to you. For simplicity, this is coming from the New Living Translation. Watching for their opportunity, the leaders sent spies pretending to be honest men. They tried to get Jesus to say something that could be reported to the Roman governor so he would arrest Jesus. Here's what they say. Teacher, we know you speak and teach what is right and are not influenced by what others think. You teach the way of God truthfully. You ever try to flatter God in your prayers? Ever try to use reverse psychology with him? Take it from someone who's tried. Don't. It just doesn't work with God. But then comes the question they try to trap Jesus with. Now tell us, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? What a loaded question. If he flat out says yes, he'll anger the people, especially a group of violent fanatics known as the Zealots. But check out how Jesus answered them. He saw through their trickery and he said this, "Show me a Roman coin whose image and title are stamped on it." Now I love the irony of the picture here. He asked them to pull out a Roman coin, and they do. In other words, they obviously didn't have a problem carrying around Roman money or using Roman money. They answer, Caesar's. It has Caesar's image on it. And then comes the answer of the ages. Well then, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. Don't you love it? They failed to trap him in his words. Instead, they're amazed by his answer, and they become silent. Probably the best move at this point. Now, I think there's a couple of direct points that we can draw from this, but also a more broader general point that I want to touch on. The first direct point is that money contains the image of human authority. Just check your own wallet. So it is subject to human use and control to a degree. However, as humans, and particularly as followers of Jesus, we are stamped with the image of God. And therefore, we are subject first and foremost to his influence and authority and control. But the other direct point I think Jesus is making through all this is that not only is money a necessity of life, but taxation is necessary for human government to operate as well, even if we don't like that government. That's what tithing was all about in the Old Testament. It was a taxation system to support a theocratic government that God had set up. There were actually 2 tithes a year and a third one every 3 years. So the tithing was really a 23% taxation system if you want to get really legalistic about it. Paying taxes is something nobody likes anyway. But for the Jews to pay taxes to Caesar, their oppressor, that was even more insulting. The tax they're talking about is a very small one. It was equivalent to 1 day's wages. Hey, I don't know about you, but I could deliver the tax like that. But the problem was it had to be paid with Roman money and not Jewish money, which was not only a reminder of their oppression, it also went to pay for things that they opposed, namely to pay the soldiers who oppressed them. You know, many Christians today oppose paying certain taxes because we don't like some of the things that they get used for. But listen, we are not held accountable by God for how the government uses the money. We are accountable by whether we honor the government that God put in place over us by obeying the taxation system they put in place. God will ultimately hold the government accountable for how they use it in his own time. But this leads to a broader picture that I want to look at this morning, and that is honoring the governing authorities. You know, just a few miles from where we used to live in the Tampa area and where my older daughter and her husband still live, there was a pastor of a large church this past week who's been arrested for blatantly ignoring the order of the local governing authorities to avoid large gatherings by having his normal Sunday service. Another pastor did the same thing in Louisiana. I've been told that even in our own area, a couple of churches had still been meeting as of a week ago. Now, as I understand it, these pastors justified this as a freedom of religion issue and a separation of church and state issue. Honestly, though, in my own opinion, nothing can be further from the truth. You see, the authorities are not asking or singling out churches to do anything they're not asking everyone else to do, to take measures to reduce the risk of something that we don't yet have control over. So this is not a freedom of religion issue, but rather one of lovingly looking out for the safety of our members and our attenders. But even beyond that, it is a matter of being obedient to governing authorities as long as it does not conflict with God's commands. The New Testament is full of scriptures that speak to this. Romans 13 is the most common. 1 Peter chapter 2, 1 Timothy chapter 2, Titus chapter 3, and so on and so forth. So for those of you who saw these reports, just know that churches that defy the recommendations in this environment are the exception, and I might even add an embarrassment to the rest of us who are wishing to honor God by honoring the government as well, and it's also honoring the people by keeping their safety in mind. But let me also take one more step further while I have your attention. On social media in the past decade, I've seen many people I know who claim to be followers of Jesus say things about this president and even the past presidents. Things like hashtag not my president. Let me tell you something. If you follow Jesus, nothing can be further from the truth, no matter who the president is or how they do things. Scripture tells us that it is ultimately God who put the authorities in their place, even in a voting system like ours. To dishonor government authorities in that way is to dishonor God. That doesn't mean you have to like everything they do or everything they say or how they do it or how they say it. But it does mean that you need to acknowledge and to accept that they are God's servant for the moment. Just as Nebuchadnezzar was called God's servant in the Old Testament, just as Caesar is in the New Testament. Even when he faced him face to face, Jesus told Pontius Pilate, or he never told Pontius Pilate, hey, you're not my governor. He just reminded him where his authority came from. You know, last year in 2019, one of the themes that seemed to keep coming up in the series that we were going through was the theme of submission. And what we learned about submission in the biblical sense is that whether it's in a marriage relationship or in a work relationship or even a government relationship, submission is not a position of weakness. It is a position of strength that gives you credibility and influence and even spiritual authority. So, as spiritual leaders and followers of Jesus, we honor God by demonstrating love for our more vulnerable friends and family members, and we demonstrate strength through our submission to our governing authorities who are asking us to take measures of safety in the current climate. So until next time, friends, stay safe, but stay connected. Love you.